Alright, so we're going to start with section 4.1, Art and Community. So art is commonly thought of as individualistic. We think of a single artist or a single patron, or maybe a gallery or institution, but sometimes art can involve large numbers of people or an entire community. So a community by definition is a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common. Um, Community creates a feeling of fellowship with others because of those shared common attitudes, interests, and goals. Now, community art is art that is by, for, or about a community. The Tate Museum defines community art as artistic activity that is based in a community setting, characterized by interaction or dialogue with the community, and often involving a professional artist collaborating with people who may or may not otherwise engage in the arts. So communal art or community art is intended for communal viewing. Viewing, use, or benefit, that is. It typically involves many individuals working together to construct the work. It may provide a backdrop or some sort of important role within the community as a source of events or activities. But community art typically increases accessibility. And looking at art made by and for various communities throughout history can really tell us a lot about the interactions between artists and their environments, as well as between art and culture or society in general. In week 2, we talked about how we experience architecture more directly than many other forms of art. And buildings typically have a pretty direct impact on their communities. Buildings that are designed to gather people together. Your book talks about Gothic cathedrals in this fashion. But buildings that are designed to gather people together or to sort of bring communities together, either for entertainment or specific activities, these have been created since antiquity. We're looking here at the Roman Colosseum, or otherwise known as the Flavian Amphitheater, probably the most recognizable Roman building there is. Typically, Roman emperors catered to their citizens' love of sports by creating these huge communal facilities. This one is one of the biggest Roman buildings and truly an extraordinary feat of architectural design and engineering. So the Flavian Amphitheater here was built by the Flavian dynasty of Roman emperors. The name Colosseum comes from the giant statue of the Emperor Nero that stood nearby. It was called Colossus, but this, again, is the biggest Roman building, so it's colossal itself. It's 615 feet long by about 510 feet across and 159 feet tall. It's got about a 2,000-foot circumference. It could accommodate anywhere from about 50,000 to 80,000 people. There were 76 entrances, which the Latin word for that would have been vomitoria, so you get sort of this vivid mental picture of the crowds that could spill out of these entrances after such events. But there are 3 levels of seating that circle a central arena, and the tiers of seating are arranged in a way that provided uninterrupted views for everyone. So no matter where a person was sitting within the stadium, they could see all of the action happening on the floor below. Now, there are also barrel-vaulted access corridors and tunnels underneath the tiers of seats and additional standing room at the top. The top wall had a very large canvas awning that was controlled by ropes and pulleys, so it could be extended over the arena for shade. The floor itself was about 280 by 175 feet, and it was laid over a foundation of rooms and tunnels that were used as service areas, rooms for athletes and the performers, storage, places to keep animals, and for transportation about the arena as well. And then the floor is covered in sand, or it was, excuse me, for athletic events, fights between gladiators and animals, trained animal performances, acrobatic performances, and sometimes even the floor was flooded and they staged mock naval battles here. So during the roughly 100-day opening ceremonies of the Colosseum, which occurred in about 80 CE, an estimated 9,000 animals and 2,000 gladiators died. Um, this structure was used for entertainment for about 400 years, and a total estimate of about 400,000 people died, along with millions of animals, including species that are extinct today, such as the Balkan lions, which went extinct in about the year 1000, as well as North African elephants, which were extinct by about 300 CE. But this is a really great example of how community art and often works of architecture can serve as symbols of particular areas. I mean, if we think about the Roman Empire, or perhaps even just Rome as a city today, the Colosseum is quite the iconic image of that. So the Islamic mosque is another great example of the integration between architecture and community. Mosques are the centers of Islamic worship, but they're really also sort of a heart within the community itself. And that began with the establishment of the first mosque, which was the house of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. This was established in about 624, so 7th century. It was a mud brick structure with about 50 square meters of an inner courtyard, pretty conducive for kind of outdoor gatherings. Along the south end of the structure was a colonnade of palm tree trunks that supported a flat roof of palm fronds that protected people from the sun. And then along the north end was a small roofed area to shelter homeless individuals. There was also a section of private living quarters, 4 apartments with subdivisions, and 5 small huts for Muhammad and his family. The courtyard gates in the east, north, and west walls to allow people in from different sides of the structure. But this structure doubled as a domestic space as well as a civic center and a place of worship. And here is the Prophet's Mosque in Medina today. And it still serves many of the same functions. So the functions of a mosque are as a meeting place, a council chamber, a courtroom, treasury, a center for military operations. In some, traders and scholars would gather there. Books were published and read aloud. As I mentioned before, there was an area for the homeless to sleep. A mosque complex could include a school, lodgings for students, a covered market, maybe a cemetery. So it's not just a sacred space for worship, but really for community activity in general. The mosques, excuse me, the mosque form tends to be wider than it is deep, with a relatively flat roof that is supported by a hypostyle interior. So remember, a hypostyle hall being one that's full of columns with a flat roof, right? Pretty simple style, and that allowed for the mosque to sort of continually grow larger as the numbers of worshipers increased. So there are a few specific features of mosque architecture that I want to talk about with you. First of those is the mihrab. So a mihrab is sort of this concave prayer niche, which indicates the direction of Mecca, and it marks out what's called the Qibla wall. That's Qibla. So one of the 5 pillars of Islam is prayer, And that means that no matter where a Muslim is in the world, at specific times during the day, they are to stop what they're doing and pray in the direction of Mecca. And so a mosque has the Qibla wall, the wall that faces the direction of Mecca. And on that Qibla wall, a mihrab, this prayer niche, which typically remains empty. It can be decorative like this one or relatively plain, but it's an empty niche within the Qibla wall that points out the direction of Mecca. Um, this one is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It used to be at a mosque complex in Iran. It's about 11 feet tall and covered in this really ornate tile work. It's quite a fine example of the architectural ceramic decoration from this era in Iran. These were made by cutting each individual piece of tile, including the letters. If you noticed around the edges, the tile is in calligraphy shapes or calligraphy forms. So we have this color scheme of white against turquoise and cobalt blue with then some accents of dark yellow and green. Really creates this dense but harmonious, contrasting organic and geometric pattern. And again, around the edge we have calligraphic script. It's called Kufic, Kufic script. And it is actually, in Arabic, the 5 pillars of Islam. So there's sort of a sermon incorporated into the decoration around this. So as worshippers orient themselves towards Mecca to pray, if they were in this mosque, they would face this mihrab, and then they could sort of look at the ornate tile work and read the scripture around the edge there to sort of focus their thoughts and keep their prayers sort of on the right track, right? Here's another example in a very different style, kind of to show how some, like I said, can be quite ornate and some can be rather plain. This one in Saint-Denis is rather simple, kind of modern, very clean lines. They've included a little clock above the mihrab niche to sort of allow the worshippers to keep the time. And if you notice, the carpet has little sections within its own design so that people know where to stand and it stays nice and orderly within here. But notice to the right of the mihrab, to the right of that niche, we have what's called a minbar, M-I-N-B-A-R. So a minbar is a sort of 3-stepped pulpit that sits again to the right of the mihrab, and this is a sort of stand from which the imam or the priest delivers their sermon during Friday prayer. Typically during the Friday prayer sermon, a ruler's name is acknowledged by the imam to sort of highlight the close relationship between politics and religion within Islam. And like the mihrab, the minbar can be kind of simple, just a platform. Early ones were typically simple and made of stone or wood, or they can be quite ornate. This one is from the 12th century and it's inlaid with ivory, mother of pearl, and several different kinds of wood in this geometric pattern using 8 pointed stars and elongated hexagons. And in some cases, the minbar becomes a sort of miniature architectural structure that kind of reflects the forms and decorative themes of the larger mosque itself. So not only does it increase the accessibility to the sermon and to the Islamic faith by placing the imam high and kind of in a way that he can be seen and heard throughout the sermon by all who are in the room. Um, it also is a very sort of creative and artistic um, form. Notice here in this mosque in Cairo, Egypt, let me turn on my laser pointer. In this particular mosque, so this entire bit here is our minbar. We have our mihrab, our prayer niche here, and then to the right, our minbar, our steps for the imam to stand on. So it has its own little doorway here. So the imam would first stop before the door, likely pausing to say a prayer, and then entering through the door, climb the steps to this sort of pulpit or platform area, which also has its own little sort of covering as well. So another important feature of mosque architecture is the minaret. Minarets are tall towers from which the faithful are called to prayer. Now, these were not in use at the time of Muhammad, so they weren't in use in the first mosques, but they became a popular feature later. So the word minaret is related to the Arabic word nur, N-U-R, which is the Arabic word for light. So these potentially can be thought of as sort of lighthouses to guide travelers across seas, or in this case, deserts. So they sort of point out the location of the mosque from farther away. But they also functioned as watchtowers. So again, we have this sort of mix of religious and political realms. Sometimes a minaret could be constructed as a sort of monument of a Muslim victory. The earliest ones were attached to mosques sometime in the 660s in southern Iraq, but those have not survived. Typically, early mosques only had one minaret, if any, but later their number increased, which we'll look at in just a moment. Here we're looking at a pretty early one from the 9th century. This is in Tunisia, and you can see it's rather squat, not as tall as they will be later, and square. But soon, sort of over time, the minarets tend to become taller. They increase in height and become a bit more slender and a bit more cylindrical rather than square. And again, they increase in number. You can see here at this mosque in Istanbul, Turkey, there are 4 on sort of the corners of the mosque here. We also have an iwan. An iwan is a porch that's sort of in the center of the sides of a mosque. These serve as entrances to the mosque themselves, but large iwans could be used as prayer halls, meeting places, to simply escape from the sun and rest in the shade. Again, a place for the homeless to sleep, or sometimes an area would be set up for them to bathe. The iwan is sometimes framed by an elaborately decorated architectural kind of facade or frontispiece called a pishtak, which you can see that here on the left image, this sort of elaborate tile work that we've seen before, right? This is the Great Mosque, or the Great Friday Mosque from Isfahan. It was rebuilt in the 11th and 12th centuries. And so typically the iwan on the Qibla wall being the wall that is facing their direction of Mecca, typically that iwan is the largest and deepest of the 4 around the complex. So I mentioned that the iwan could have several uses. From the earliest period of Islam, mosques were often centers of education, and Then later, the Sunni Muslims began to build madrasas, which were teaching colleges that were attached to mosques. Here, students lived and studied the Quran, as well as Islamic law, anatomy, poetry, and other subjects. The first madrasas seem to have appeared in about the 11th century. Typically, a madrasa is built around an open courtyard using the 4 iwans. The mosque and mosque complexes are incredibly important to Islamic community, um, but as a global religion, um, this also sort of creates a sense of a global or perhaps a spiritual community as a whole. So each feature of a mosque sort of relates back to, yes, a spiritual aspect, but also a communal function, calling the community to prayer, helping the community orient themselves in the direction of Mecca during prayer, providing spaces for the community to meet or to rest, for the homeless in the community to have shelter, etc., etc. And in this case, for the community to come and learn about various subjects, including the Quran and other sort of religious works, but other things too. So, in the year 630, the Prophet Muhammad led an army of 10,000 people to the city of Mecca and reclaimed it as the spiritual center of the Islamic world. Muhammad and his followers went to the Kaaba, which is a cube-shaped, textile-draped shrine. At the time, it housed the main Arabian deities. It was believed to have been built by Abraham and Ishmael, the ancestors of Muhammad. So he was sort of seeking to reclaim the structure of his ancestors from polytheism. So he goes and he emptied the shrine of all pagan idols and rededicated it to Allah. And now the Kaaba is the most sacred site in the Islamic world, and it's in Mecca, so it's in the direction to which all Muslims pray. Um, I mentioned the 5 pillars of the Islamic faith. Those are the profession of faith, prayer, giving alms, fasting, and pilgrimage. And so, again, these are sort of directly incorporated into the mosque complex and the mosque architecture, right? Um, prayer 5 times daily in the direction of Mecca, so Muslims everywhere stop and pray at the same time all around the world. And then pilgrimage as another pillar of faith, that is specific to Mecca and Kaaba. Muslims are supposed to travel there at least once in their lifetime if possible. So again, really there's this immediate community within the mosque and sort of surrounding the mosque itself, but there's also a sort of global community amongst Muslims that's excuse me, that is established by shared interests and experiences surrounding these architectural structures that are similar and serve the same functions all around the world. And the Kaaba, as the most sacred site in the Islamic faith, is now housed at the Sacred Mosque or Grand Mosque of Mecca. So this is the largest mosque in the world, and again in Mecca, so the direction to which all Muslims pray. It covers 88.2 acres of indoor and outdoor space, and it's open 24/7. So again, that sense of global community or perhaps spiritual community, Muslims all around the world stopping together at the same time to face in the same direction, which is this mosque. So here we have the Chinese National Stadium in Beijing. This is often called the Bird's Nest. It was designed for the 2008 Summer Olympics, and really it's become an icon for China and the city of Beijing. So It cost $428 million US to build. It seats about 91,000 people, though there is room for an additional 11,000 temporary seats. It was designed by the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, along with Herzog and de Meuron Architekten, an architecture group in China, and another research group. And they sort of attempted to combine a modern sports stadium with elements of Chinese art and architecture and Chinese culture. And so we have this elliptical steel structure that surrounds a red concrete seating bowl, like an egg in a nest. The shape of the roof was inspired by the yin yang and the Chinese philosophy of balance and harmony. The circular shape represents heaven, and nearby, you can't see it in these pictures, but nearby the National Aquatic Center is a large square building which represents Earth. So we have heaven and Earth sort of next to each other here. So the structural form, or the bird's nest, if you will, is this web of twisting steel sections that form a roof. The pattern was inspired by traditional Chinese-style crazed pottery, in which tiny webs of cracks form in the glassy glazed surface. Now, this is technically a defect. It occurs when the surface of a pot and the glaze don't really match, or it cools too quickly and the glaze cracks. But crazing was highly valued in ancient China for this sort of imperfect decorative effect that it creates. So the chief architect, Li Jinggang, he had this idea of a structure that was porous yet still functional. So a crazed pot has cracks in the glaze, but the pot itself is not cracked. So it won't leak, but it will absorb a little bit of moisture. Think of if you've ever had a coffee cup and inside on the bottom, sometimes they get crazing or little cracks, and over time it will soak up some of that coffee and become stained, so those cracks are sort of highlighted by the coffee color. So again, this building is porous, but it's sort of a collective public vessel for the community, for anyone who comes to the event within. Now the nest structure itself looks sort of random, but it actually follows very strict rules of geometry, using about 36 kilometers of unwrapped steel. So we have these giant curving beams that sort of crisscross and bring all the spectators as close as possible to the action within. And it really allows for open, uninterrupted views for all, as well as open airflow. Now there's also a sort of seismic design at work here. The outer steel covering is separate from the inner stadium bowl, which allows the structures to move independently in case of an earthquake, which Beijing is one of the most seismic areas in the world. Now, again, this was designed for the 2008 Olympics, which were known as the Green Olympics, because of the high levels of pollution in Beijing. The administration of the Olympics? I don't know what to call it. Anyway, they required that all of the venues and facilities that were being constructed for the Olympics here had to meet environmental and energy efficiency standards. So here we have a sort of open air roof that allows natural light and airflow. It reduces the energy used by artificial lights, ventilation systems, or any kind of electricity for a retractable roof, like a lot of stadiums these days have. Instead, it has this transparent membrane that covers the roof. It sort of lets in light, but it's also good for the regulation of heat, so it's not freezing or it's not too hot or whatever. There's also a rainwater recycling system on site that allows the structure to collect, clean, cool, and use all of the water. Um, so really, this place of gathering, um, they created a structure that really kind of set global standards for spectators, excuse me, spectators' experience as well as sustainability. Both are treated sort of equally importantly here, um, and both for the good of the community as a whole, I think. Community art can also be considered public art, which is installed for the public or in a public space. Typically, public art is planned and executed with the intention of being staged in a physical public domain, usually outside where it's accessible to all. Um, Monuments or memorials, this is a good example of public art. Think of the statue of George Washington that's installed in the Boston Public Square Gardens, or maybe Lord Horatio Nelson in the Trafalgar Square in London. Um, Sometimes public art can be fun and whimsical. Here we have A Fountain by Jean-Paul Riopelle. It runs a 32-minute kinetic sequence in which water forms a dome over the fountain and mist rises from the grates in the ground, and then a ring of fire comes up. Um, Here we have a work by the American artist Dennis Oppenheim. This is his bus home from 2002. This was a bus shelter produced for the city of Ventura, California. Very whimsical, but it has practical elements as well. This is a bus terminal, so it provides shelter, but also communicates the desire and the ability to sort of get home. Um, but sometimes public art can be controversial. Um, we're looking at a photograph of Richard Serra's Tilted Arc from 1981. Um, Richard Serra was commissioned by the Federal General Services Administration to create a public work of art to be installed in the Federal Plaza in New York City in 1981. And this Tilted Arc is what he came up with. It's 12 feet tall and 120 feet long. It's made of steel, weatherproof steel, and it caused a lot of controversy. So, to understand that controversy, first let's take a detour to look at some of Serra's other work. So Richard Serra was a minimalist artist. So he was interested in the essence of things, as well as materials themselves and kind of this idea of movement. He often used heavy steel as well as very simple shapes or sort of drapes of the heavy material. So this is his work from 90 and 91, Weathering Steel. Here he's interested in sort of the natural setting and how the steel kind of frames the hill and the sky, as well as the weathering process of the material itself. Here we have this massive undulating wall of steel that sort of conforms to the natural contour of the hill. Um, Serra has a real sort of sense of awareness of space in one sense, but he's also demonstrating a sort of assertion of self in another. Here's one from 2005. This is titled The Matter of Time. It was installed in Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum in Spain. Thinking about scale here, notice the person, and you can sort of see how he's wanting people to kind of walk in and around and back out of these structures and kind of have the art become the experience itself. Okay, so back to Tilted Arc. As soon as it was installed, all of these complaints started rolling in. The people who worked in the GSA building complained that Serra's public work of art was a safety hazard. They said it attracted rats and criminals and maybe even bombers and graffiti artists. And they also argued that it interfered with their use of the plaza. They didn't like that they had to walk all the way around this huge piece of metal just to go into work. They couldn't have any kind of concerts or events in the plaza because it interrupts the space. But Sarah was really interested in how the sculpture could make a person aware of one's experience with the space that they were in. So truly, it was doing exactly what he intended it to do. At the time, his response to the protests, he said, "I make work that deals with the environmental components of given places. The historical purpose of placing sculpture on a pedestal was to establish a separation between the sculpture and the viewer. I am interested in creating a behavioral space in which the viewer interacts with the sculpture in its context." So in 1986, Tilted Arc was moved to a parking lot, but Richard Serra was outraged. He declared that the work was site-specific, and therefore to remove it is to destroy it, and it cannot exist anywhere else. He filed a lawsuit for censorship, but he lost. And in March of 1989, during the middle of the night, federal workers came in and cut up the sculpture and took it to a scrapyard. So this sort of brings up questions about to what extent does the artist get to sort of express their creative freedom, and to what extent do they have to please their patron or please the public? Richard Serra said, "I don't think it is the function of art to be pleasing. Art is not democratic. It is not for the people." What do you think about that? Especially in the instance of public art, which could be argued very much for the people because it's in public. So kind of an interesting argument to think about there. So another controversial work of public art is Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial from 1982. So a memorial, it's meant to commemorate a person or people or an event, right? So the city wanted a symbol of national healing over the divisive Vietnam War installed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Maya Lin, who was a college student at Yale at the time, was awarded the commission for her proposal of a simple yet dramatic memorial that cut into and emerged from the ground like a V-shaped scar. So the memorial sits on the National Mall between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial, and the ends of the Vietnam Memorial sort of point to each of these other memorials. It consists of 247-foot long slabs of polished black granite that meet at a 130-degree angle. At the corner where it meets, the slabs are 10 feet tall, and then they sort of slowly submerge underground as they stretch outward. The reflective quality of the marble really allows visitors to see themselves along with 58,272 inscribed names of American soldiers that were killed or went missing in action during Vietnam. Maya Lin wanted the memorial to be an experience. She wanted it to be part of the communal healing process. So it's public art, but it's also intended to be sort of intimate for those who come visit. She wanted to take an apolitical approach as well. She wanted to memorialize what had been sacrificed and not really question whether or not the war was good or bad, shameful or honorable. There is still a bit of a political aspect to it, of course. Even in the materials, the best black granite, the stuff that she wanted to use, that was available from Canada and Sweden. But at the time, both nations were places that draft dodgers were fleeing to, and so she could not obtain materials from those countries. So the political implications or aspect is sort of inescapable here. And once it was finished, the reception was sort of controversial. One opponent to the work said, "One needs no artistic education to see this memorial for what it is, a black scar and a hole hidden as if out of shame." Um, some argued that the color should be changed to white, or that a figurative sculpture should be added at the apex of the work. Um, and ultimately, they resolved the controversy by adding a very naturalistic representation of a group of soldiers nearby. Maya Lin opposed that, but the Commission of Fine Arts overruled her, and then they came back and added a flagpole too. So, what do you think about these additions? Does this compromise the original design or the content or meaning of the original work? Or do you think that that was a good way to resolve things? And you can sort of think about Richard Serra's Tilted Arc and Maya Lin's Memorial together. These are both sort of minimalist works, right? But does one show more awareness of the community than the other? Here we're looking at Wall Street's Charging Bull by Arturo Demodica. So on December 15th, 1989, Demodica installed his charging bull under the Christmas tree in front of the New York Stock Exchange in the middle of the night without a permit. And he said it was a symbol of American financial resilience in response to the 1987 stock market crash. So he started working on it in '87 after the crash and spent 2 years working in his studio in Manhattan and then finished it in 1989. It weighs over 3.5 tons and is about 16 to 18 feet long. Within 8 hours of its installation, it was impounded, but the public loved it so much they demanded it stay in the financial district near Wall Street. So it was later reinstalled at the north end of the Bowling Green, which is America's oldest park, in the financial district. The artist said, "My bull is a symbol for America. My bull is a symbol of prosperity and strength." And he said that it symbolized the bullish determination of Wall Street and the American people. Fast forward to 2017, sponsored by the State Street Global Advisors and commissioned by McCann Advertising, the artist Kristen Visbel installed her Fearless Girl in the Bowling Green on March 7th, 2017, which was the eve of International Women's Day that year. And she installed Fearless Girl in the direct path of Demodica's Charging Bull to call attention to the glass ceiling regarding pay and promotion of women in the Wall Street community. She also was trying to make a point about the lack of women on boards of the largest U.S. corporations and on Wall Street. So the work was an immediate hit, and it was a tourist magnet, and really hailed as sort of this iconic image of female empowerment. However, it was also immediately controversial. So many people called it an act of fake corporate feminism because in September of 2017, just a few months after its installation, its sponsor, State Street, settled a $5 million lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Labor that claimed systematic discrimination against female and black employees. So that sort of raises questions about their motivations for the sponsorship of the work in the first place. There was also another artist who installed a work titled Pissing Pug, a bronze cast, I believe, of a pug peeing. They set it up peeing on the Fearless Girl's leg and called her corporate nonsense. And then the Charging Bull, the artist of the Charging Bull, gets involved. So Arturo Demodica said Fearless Girl was an advertising trick, and that it was a violation of his rights because she changed the meaning and context of his sculpture without his permission. He argued that his intended message of freedom, world peace, strength, power, and love had been deliberately transformed into a negative force and threat. And he argued that she should be removed. In the argument, he and his team sort of stated that the work, as in Fearless Girl, is incomplete without Charging Bull, and as such, it constitutes a derivative work. The statue of the girl, hands on her hips, only becomes fearless because of the much larger aggressive bull. So again, sort of an interesting argument to be made here for both sides, I think. So kind of consider your thoughts on this as well. Now, in 2018, Fearless Girl was moved. She was moved to a location outside of the New York Stock Exchange. However, the controversy is not completely over. The artist, Visible, has been fighting court disputes since 2019 against State Street because they are trying to deny her any rights or any ownership rights of the work that she created. So an ongoing controversy as well.